Hi everyone! In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a donkey in pastels. Now for this, as you can see, I have added a few Christmas elements here to make it into a festive tutorial for my Patreon channel, but I do want to be making sure that I still, for this project, focus on all of the detail and realism. So I'm still using the same principles that I would for any other project, the layering, pencil technique, contrast and so on, and that's what I'm going to focus this tutorial on. Now this is a smaller project, only being 6 by 8 inches. I do need to be realistic with how much detail I can include. Now that being said, I'm still able to make this look three-dimensional because I'm going to be focusing on my values throughout this project. Now here I'm creating a colour swatch to explain which pencils to mix together if you don't have a specific colour in your set. Now this is a question that I'm asked frequently, is how do I know which pencils to pick? What do I need to do to mix certain pencils together to get that one colour if we don't have that specific pencil? Now as you saw there, I was able to mix a few different pencils together and get the same colour of an individual pencil. So if you don't have that specific colour, you can layer your pencils together, and the wonderful thing with pastels is they blend so beautifully. It's a really nice way of working. It takes a little bit more of that pressure off about trying to worry about the exact colour at each stage. Now for me personally, it's something that I don't focus on or worry about in my projects too much. I don't sit there for ages thinking, oh, I need to have this one specific colour. For me, I will pick whether or not it is a light colour or a dark colour, and whether or not that colour is warm or cool, depending on that reference photo. So this is something that I like to focus my Patreon tutorials on because I know colour selection and how to mix those layers and colours can cause quite a lot of confusion. Now the wonderful thing is, if you break everything up into individual layers as I am here and only focus on your lights and your darks, the colour selection process becomes easier. Now the reason this is my preferred way of working is I also like to work in graphite, and obviously there's no colour required. It's all about focusing on your lights and your darks and the contrast. So I implement those same rules in my colour-based mediums, the pastels and acrylics. Now here, as you can see, the layering process is playing a very important role in that value and contrast. So I'm starting off with adding in some of my darker colours, and now I'm coming back in with my highlights. It's really important to build up these layers gradually. I didn't start off with a really dark base layer in this situation and then jump to my brightest highlights. It was all about making sure that I had a nice soft base layer, which you can see I'm already starting to capture here on the right hand side. And then I'm making sure to look at my reference photo and break that up to the fur or the hair that I think is closest to the skin and work up from there. If I can visualise it like that in my mind, I find it much easier to follow that reference photo. Now again, this is something that I talk through in my real-time tutorials on Patreon, and the tutorials there are recorded with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so every single process is explained in the moment. And I feel that this is a really worthwhile way of explaining in the tutorials because there are some decisions that I make in that second. You know, I'm using those pencils, I'm layering those pastels, and I might decide to change my technique depending on that reference photo, that situation, and I can explain that as I go. Now something that I'm really focusing on for the ears of this donkey is the fur direction. Now I've got a video here on YouTube, it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But in that video I talk about 3 main pencil techniques. So the fur direction, the fur length and fur thickness. Now all of these things are very important if we're trying to draw photorealism and capturing that fur or hair accurately. Now as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is a smaller project, but I'm still able to get a nice amount of detail here in the ears. Because I'm focusing on the main fur directional changes, the way that I'm moving that pencil, the thickness of my pencil strokes and the length of my pencil strokes, I'm not able to add in each individual hair that I can see of what this donkey would have, but I can certainly add enough to give the impression of those. Now when I started working on the hat, I actually ran into a couple of problems here. I wanted the hat to be a nice red vibrant colour, and I didn't have one of those reds in my pastel pencil set. So here I'm using a Rembrandt soft pastel stick to get a base foundation colour in place. Now I'm very careful not to feel the tooth of the paper when I work with pastels, because that's something that can be incredibly limiting as you then go to work with your details on top. If you feel the tooth of the paper, you'll feel like your pencils are just gliding across the surface and the pigment is not able to be visible. It can't grip that paper because there's no tooth left. And that's what started to happen here. Now it's one of the reasons why I do not use soft pastel sticks directly to my surface. I just find it's very, very easy to feel the tooth of the paper. Now I am very careful with how much pastel I apply because it's something that I know can happen very easily. And it still happened here. Didn't feel the tooth of the paper completely, but it was certainly enough where I was only able to go back in and add 1 or 2 layers with my pencils. Now, although this is technically an issue that obviously I could have done without, this is a very important learning experience. So whenever I come across mistakes or issues in my work, I will always leave that in my real-time tutorials on Patreon because it's just part of the drawing process. Now, what is really useful is it's knowing how to fix those mistakes. That's what makes us better as artists and helps us to improve our drawing skills. So on the Patreon version, I showed exactly what I did to overcome this issue, and as you can see here, I was still able to hint at the shading, the lights and the darks on top of the red layer, and it's worked out perfectly fine. But it's something that I can now have that information to use, and I definitely know that I just would never use the soft pastel sticks on that very first base layer stage. Now, one thing that you can do, and this is a technique that I use all of the time, I have quite a few of the pan pastels, but not all of the colours. If I use pan pastels for my base layer, they blend beautifully, but if there is a colour that I don't have there, I will actually sand down a soft pastel stick and then use that in the same way as my pan pastel pigment. Now, this is something that can work really well, and I would definitely recommend to use that method rather than the soft pastel sticks directly to the paper, if you do know that you are going to have that problem of filling the tooth of the paper. Now, of course, you can use the soft pastel sticks, and I know many artists use that method and they don't run into any problems at all. But it's something for me that I am just very cautious about. I was very careful when I used that red on this layer, and it did still apply more pastel for that first layer than I actually wanted. So when it came to working on the face, this is where I could really focus how to change the pencil technique for drawing the skin of the nose, and then how to create the shorter pencil strokes for the short fur on the face. Now, as you can see here, I'm not actually using pan pastels or soft pastel sticks for my base layer. I decided to use my pastel pencils from start to finish. I do like working this way. I feel like I have a little bit more of a control of exactly where my lights and darks are going. But for this, I just wanted to have an extra bit of variety and choice from the Patreon tutorials. Not all of my tutorials I'm using pan pastels for my base layer. I like to make sure that I've got a variety so that any artists who maybe don't have pan pastels can still know that they can create photorealistic work just with their pencils from the very beginning. Now again, this is all about a blocking in, mapping in process. So here I'm just hinting at where my main lights and darks are, but everything is nice and soft. There are no harsh edges apart from the nostrils themselves, and even those edges have been softened to some degree. I want to then be focusing on the subtle layers on top of that. Now, I've already mentioned about this when the video started, but the use of subtle layers is what's going to help to build up the depth within the fur or the skin, whatever it may be that we're working on. I don't want to be adding in those brightest highlights right from the very beginning because they are what are sitting on top. So for me, I like to leave those until that last layer. Now, the very last element that I do like to work with is, of course, the whiskers. Now, they overlap everything else, so you do want to be leaving those until you know that all of the base layers underneath or the elements behind those whiskers are finished. So at the moment, I've just decided to leave the nose here as it is, and then I can come back and work on the face. Now, the one difference here with this fur is it's significantly shorter than the ears. So I'm using all of the same pencil technique, but I'm modifying those. I'm really focusing on how I need to apply the pressure to the pencil, how I need to hold the pencil, where should I hold the pencil. You very rarely see me hold that right up close to the lead, because one of the things that will do is it will force lots of pressure on the tip of the pencil, and then you can end up creating some really thick lines. So getting a little bit of distance away from the lead can often help us get a better angle and purchase on that pencil to create those lighter but finer details. So as I continue to block in the rest of the face, you can see here that it's going to end up really dark. This is important because if we don't have our base layers dark enough, then the layers on top are not going to have the same impact. The portrait therefore is going to have less contrast and therefore have a flatter two-dimensional appearance. So my biggest tip when you're working on drawing realistic fur is you do want to be making sure that your values are right from the very beginning. If you start adding your details and you feel like the pencils you're using are not showing up but you feel that they should be, that's an indication that you need to make your base layers a little bit darker. Now with pastels, it can be a little bit scary to go too dark for that first layer in case we feel that we can't lighten it back up. But the wonderful thing about working with pastels is how forgiving the medium is. There are many things that we can do here that can be altered as long as we don't put a hole through our paper or spill something on that surface. Pretty much anything can be resolved. Now one of those issues that can be resolved is coming up in this portrait. So again, this is something that I wouldn't leave out of my Patreon tutorials, and as you know from this video, I include them in my YouTube videos as well. When I'm working on the fencing here and then I started mapping in the snow, I anticipated when I designed this on a computer that I was going to have some snow underneath the chin that was just resting on the top section of the fence. But as I started working here and I mapped in that snow base layer, I then lost the definition on the lower lip and chin area. You can see here now that it's just completely almost disappeared into the portrait. So as I started to work more on this, it was just becoming more obvious that I needed to fix it. So I'm going to go back in with my darker pastels and completely cover that up. Now I do have to make sure that I therefore blend that in. I don't want there to be any sections of that that's visible or noticeable that I then added that in at a separate time. And as you can see here, you wouldn't know that I originally had a light white layer of pastel in first. And when these things happen, as I've mentioned in this video already, that's what gives us the confidence to say, okay, I can fix this and it's not a problem. I don't have to worry or stress about it at all. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. If you are interested in drawing along to the real-time version of this or any of my step-by-step tutorials on Patreon, then I'll link that in the description below. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. As always, thank you so much for watching.